Good evening. This is a special edition of Northwest Now here on KBTC. I'm Tom Layson. In just a moment, we'll be hearing from the President of the United States, President Obama. For only the third time in his presidency, Mr. Obama will address the nation from the Oval Office. With only 410 days left in his second term, Mr. Obama's mission tonight is to convince a nervous nation that he is taking the threat of terrorism and specifically the threat posed by ISIS more seriously. The president's approval ratings when it comes to handling terrorism and the threat posed by ISIS are down sharply, and the mass shooting in San Bernardino, California was a tipping point that the administration clearly feels made this address necessary tonight. Now, tonight, the president is expected to update the nation on the ongoing investigation into the terrorist attack in San Bernardino, California. The White House also says he'll discuss the broader threat of terrorism, the recent history of ISIS as he sees it, and perhaps lay out a more direct plan about how to defeat it in the wake of the attacks in San Bernardino and, of course, Paris, France. The president has referred to ISIS as the JV team in the past and has said that the organization is contained. His critics have seized upon that and his on-again, off-again strategic direction when it comes to dealing with ISIS. There is little doubt he will also call upon this nation's better angels when it comes to promoting religious unity, building racial tolerance, and remaining a safe harbor for refugees fleeing terrorism and oppression. The debate over guns has gained new momentum following the attack in San Bernardino, California, of course. Observers who have been in touch with the White House say the president will make a brief mention of guns in this particular case, but will not unveil any major policy initiatives tonight, leaving those for a later date. And now the president.
Americans were killed as they came together to celebrate the holidays. They were taken from family and friends who loved them deeply. They were white and black, Latino and Asian, immigrants and American-born, moms and dads, daughters and sons. Each of them served their fellow citizens, and all of them were part of our American family. Tonight I want to talk with you about this tragedy, the broader threat of terrorism, and how we can keep our country safe. The FBI is still gathering the facts about what happened in San Bernardino, but here's what we know. The victims were brutally murdered and injured by one of their co-workers and his wife. So far, we have no evidence that the killers were directed by a terrorist organization overseas or that they were part of a broader conspiracy here at home. But it is clear that the two of them had gone down the dark path of radicalization, embracing a perverted interpretation of Islam that calls for war against America and the West. They had stockpiled assault weapons, ammunition, and pipe bombs. So this was an act of terrorism designed to kill innocent people. Our nation has been at war with terrorists since al-Qaeda killed nearly 3,000 Americans on 9/11. In the process, we've hardened our defenses, from airports to financial centers to other critical infrastructure. Intelligence and law enforcement agencies have disrupted countless plots here and overseas and worked around the clock to keep us safe. Our military and counterterrorism professionals have relentlessly pursued terrorist networks overseas, disrupting safe havens in several different countries, killing Osama bin Laden, and decimating al-Qaeda's leadership. Over the last few years, however, the terrorist threat has evolved into a new phase. As we've become better at preventing complex, multifaceted attacks like 9/11, terrorists turn to less complicated acts of violence, like the mass shootings that are all too common in our society. It is this type of attack that we saw at Fort Hood in 2009, in Chattanooga earlier this year, and now in San Bernardino. And as groups like ISIL grew stronger amidst the chaos of war in Iraq and then Syria, and as the internet erases the distance between countries, we see growing efforts by terrorists to poison the minds of people like the Boston Marathon bombers and the San Bernardino killers. For 7 years, I have confronted this evolving threat each and every morning in my intelligence briefing. And since the day I took this office, I have authorized U.S. forces to take out terrorists abroad precisely because I know how real the danger is. As Commander-in-Chief, I have no greater responsibility than the security of the American people. As a father to 2 young daughters who are the most precious part of my life, I know that we see ourselves with friends and coworkers at a holiday party like the one in San Bernardino. I know we see our kids in the faces of the young people killed in Paris. And I know that after so much war, many Americans are asking whether we are confronted by a cancer that has no immediate cure. Well, here's what I want you to know. The threat from terrorism is real, but we will overcome it. We will destroy ISIL and any other organization that tries to harm us. Our success won't depend on tough talk or abandoning our values or giving in to fear. That's what groups like ISIL are hoping for. Instead, we will prevail by being strong and smart, resilient and relentless, and by drawing upon every aspect of American power. Here's how. First, our military will continue to hunt down terrorist plotters in any country where it is necessary. In Iraq and Syria, airstrikes are taking out ISIL leaders, heavy weapons, oil tankers, infrastructure. And since the attacks in Paris, our closest allies, including France, Germany, and the United Kingdom, have ramped up their contributions to our military campaign, which will help us accelerate our effort to destroy ISIL. Second, we will continue to provide training and equipment to tens of thousands of Iraqi and Syrian forces fighting ISIL on the ground so that we take away their safe havens. In both countries, we're deploying special operations forces who can accelerate that offensive. We've stepped up this effort since the attacks in Paris and will continue to invest more in approaches that are working on the ground. Third, we're working with friends and allies to stop ISIL's operations, to disrupt plots, cut off their financing, and prevent them from recruiting more fighters. Since the attacks in Paris, we've surged intelligence sharing with our European allies. We're working with Turkey to seal its border with Syria. And we are cooperating with Muslim-majority countries and with our Muslim communities here at home to counter the vicious ideology that ISIL promotes online. Fourth, with American leadership, the international community has begun to establish a process and timeline to pursue ceasefires and a political resolution to the Syrian war. Doing so will allow the Syrian people and every country, including our allies, but also countries like Russia, to focus on the common goal of destroying ISIL, a group that threatens us all. This is our strategy to destroy ISIL. It is designed and supported by our military commanders and counterterrorism experts, together with 65 countries that have joined an American-led coalition. And we constantly examine our strategy to determine when additional steps are needed to get the job done. That's why I've ordered the Departments of State and Homeland Security to review the visa waiver program under which the female terrorist in San Bernardino originally came to this country. And that's why I will urge high-tech and law enforcement leaders to make it harder for terrorists to use technology to escape from justice. Now, here at home, we have to work together to address the challenge. There are several steps that Congress should take right away. To begin with, Congress should act to make sure no one on a no-fly list is able to buy a gun. What could possibly be the argument for allowing a terrorist suspect to buy a semi-automatic weapon? This is a matter of national security. We also need to make it harder for people to buy powerful assault weapons, like the ones that were used in San Bernardino. I know there are some who reject any gun safety measures, but the fact is that our intelligence and law enforcement agencies, no matter how effective they are, cannot identify every would-be mass shooter, whether that individual is motivated by ISIL or some other hateful ideology. What we can do, and must do, is make it harder for them to kill. Next, we should put in place stronger screening for those who come to America without a visa so that we can take a hard look at whether they've traveled to war zones. And we're working with members of both parties in Congress to do exactly that. Finally, if Congress believes, as I do, that we are at war with ISIL, it should go ahead and vote to authorize the continued use of military force against these terrorists. For over a year, I have ordered our military to take thousands of airstrikes against ISIL targets. I think it's time for Congress to vote to demonstrate that the American people are united and committed to this fight. My fellow Americans, these are the steps that we can take together to defeat the terrorist threat. Let me now say a word about what we should not do. We should not be drawn once more into a long and costly ground war in Iraq or Syria. That's what groups like ISIL want. They know they can't defeat us on the battlefield. ISIL fighters were part of the insurgency that we faced in Iraq. But they also know that if we occupy foreign lands, they can maintain insurgencies for years, killing thousands of our troops, draining our resources, and using our presence to draw new recruits. The strategy that we are using now, airstrikes, special forces, and working with local forces who are fighting to regain control of their own country, that is how we'll achieve a more sustainable victory. And it won't require us sending a new generation of Americans overseas to fight and die for another decade on foreign soil. Here's what else we cannot do. We cannot turn against one another by letting this fight be defined as a war between America and Islam. That, too, is what groups like ISIL want. ISIL does not speak for Islam. They are thugs and killers, part of a cult of death. And they account for a tiny fraction of more than 1 billion Muslims around the world, including millions of patriotic Muslim Americans who reject their hateful ideology. Moreover, the vast majority of terrorist victims around the world are Muslim. If we're to succeed in defeating terrorism, we must enlist Muslim communities as some of our strongest allies, rather than push them away through suspicion and hate. That does not mean denying the fact that an extremist ideology has spread within some Muslim communities. It's a real problem that Muslims must confront without excuse. Muslim leaders here and around the globe have to continue working with us to decisively and unequivocally reject the hateful ideology that groups like ISIL and al-Qaeda promote, to speak out against not just acts of violence, but also those interpretations of Islam that are incompatible with the values of religious tolerance, mutual respect, and human dignity. But just as it is the responsibility of Muslims around the world to root out misguided ideas that lead to radicalization, it is the responsibility of all Americans, of every faith, to reject discrimination. It is our responsibility to reject religious tests on who we admit into this country. It's our responsibility to reject proposals that Muslim Americans should somehow be treated differently. Because when we travel down that road, we lose. That kind of divisiveness, that betrayal of our values, plays into the hands of groups like ISIL. Muslim Americans are our friends and our neighbors, our co-workers, our sports heroes. And yes, they are our men and women in uniform who are willing to die in defense of our country. We have to remember that. My fellow Americans, I am confident we will succeed in this mission because we are on the right side of history. We were founded upon a belief in human dignity, that no matter who you are or where you come from or what you look like or what religion you practice, you are equal in the eyes of God and equal in the eyes of the law. Even in this political season, even as we properly debate what steps I and future presidents must take to keep our country safe, let's make sure we never forget what makes us exceptional. Let's not forget that freedom is more powerful than fear. That we have always met challenges, whether war or depression, natural disasters or terrorist attacks, by coming together around our common ideals as one nation and one people. So long as we stay true to that tradition, I have no doubt that America will prevail. Thank you. God bless you, and may God bless the United States of America.
President Barack Obama addressing the nation tonight from the Oval Office at the White House. This is only the third time the president has used that setting, the Oval Office, in his presidency due to the import in the administration's feeling about tonight's address. Let's talk a little bit about some of the major points that came out of this. The president opened by talking about the terrorist attack in San Bernardino, California, acknowledging that the suspects had indeed gone down the, quote, dark path of radicalization, and that, quote, this was an act of terrorism. The threat is real, but we will defeat it, he said, and asked all Americans who are watching in tonight to be resilient and relentless, along with him and the administration, as a strategy for defeating ISIL is laid out. Answering the question about how exactly that happens, he laid out a multi-point strategy which included continuing airstrikes, continuing to build relationships with strong allies in the region, deploying special operations forces more, which is something that has happened recently. He continues to indicate that men, machines, and supplies, along with special operations force, will be something that we'll continue to see in terms of deployments overseas. Interrupt operations with technology and through financial and banking operations to keep ISIS off balance in terms of funding their missions, pursuing resolution to the war in Syria with a focus on ISIS, allowing all the combatants in that particular civil war in the nation of Syria to get out of that so that the focus can be turned strictly on defeating ISIS, or ISIL as he calls it, in the Middle East. The president also called for a review of the visa waiver program, which, if you'll recall, was how the female suspect in the San Bernardino shooting got into the United States. And he called on Congress specifically tonight, talking about weapons, asking that nobody on a no-fly list should be able to buy a gun, and also asking Congress to examine assault weapons and their availability. So it does indeed look like those issues will be coming up in the future days and weeks as the president continues to pursue this domestically. One of the things that the president also outlined are the things that cannot happen in his view, those being no long and costly ground war in the Middle East following up on more than a decade of combat in Afghanistan and Iraq. And second, indicating that the American people cannot turn against each other, calling out ISIL as a death cult, and an exception to the rule when it comes to the religion of Islam, and asking that we not condemn Islam and its billions of peaceful followers as we continue to pursue the defeat of ISIL and in the Middle East. That was the president, once again, Barack Obama, speaking to us from the White House tonight. We appreciate you joining us for this special edition of Northwest Now here on KBTC, and we now join Foyle's War in Progress.